One of the best ways to see whether or not you've got a good army is whether or not it can beat other strong lists. With that in mind, let's take a look at 5 of the best. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're going to do a small thought experiment, take your best army list, and see how it might shape up to some of the nastiest armies in the game right now. We'll look at 5 of the strongest examples of some of the nastiest 40k armies around, all of which have proven themselves at major tournaments, so if you manage to draw this list of matchups in the tournament from hell, let me know how you think you'd manage to get on. So first up, I thought we'd start with Admech, and with none other than Richard Siegler's list, who placed first at the Orlando Open, the Games Workshop in-house Grand Tournament. It's pretty interesting to see the evolution of the Admech army after Games Workshop dropped a few nerfs on them recently, making big blobs of Rangers and Vanguard a little bit less effective, and making Iron Striders no longer core. The answer seems to be a very hefty amount of models run in the Metallica Forge world, a lot of which have 2 wounds, and all of them have a 5+ invul save. Metallica allows you to move and shoot with heavy weapons or advance and shoot with assault weapons for no penalty whatsoever. They have a ton of really quite helpful mobility related stratagems, and then that's combined with the Skitarii veteran cohort that gives some really quite interesting Doctrina imperative manipulation and some other powerful stratagems for core Skitarii infantry. A few of those helpful buffs are centered on the characters. The formation is led by a pair of marshals, one with the Cantic Thrallnet and Calculate without diversion. The Thrallnet is perhaps the single best piece of gear in the Skitarii veteran cohort. It allows you to put one unit into a different Doctrina each turn. Could be really handy for some extra saves from Bulwark, extra accuracy with Protector, or even a decent amount extra movement if you sacrifice your saves somewhat. The Thrallnet allows you to use the really good veteran cohort stratagems for 0 CP, provided the army happens to be in the right doctrine. There's a few good ones, including Advance and Charge, a 5+ Feel No Pain type save to make one unit extra hard to shift, and one that can give you extra wound rolls on the enemy with a couple of units. The other marshal has the more standard rerolls one, reroll ones to hit and wound with the Exemplar's Eternity, and has quite interestingly taken the Eyes of the Omnissiah, one that allows one unit to reroll Advance and Charge rolls. I can't say I've seen that one taken very often, but in combination with that veteran cohort stratagem to allow you to advance and charge, this could give some of the units on the board such as the Ruststalkers or the Cerberus Raiders an absolutely crazy threat range. There's a good number of troops that can all keep up some good firepower on the move due to Metallica, and they do all cost 10 points and have a 5+ invul save due to the veteran cohort. One unit of 19 Rangers with a programmed retreat warlord trait, that's the one that allows them to fall back and shoot. 3 small units of 5 veteran Rangers and 2 small units of veteran Vanguard. The Vanguard could be particularly interesting for that rad oversaturation ability. 2 command points to give a big aura of 6 inches of rad saturation, allowing you to potentially shoot enemies that are -1 toughness. Moving on, we've then got a pretty crazy amount of more elite Skitarii, I believe almost 70 models, all with more than 1 wound and all with 5+ invul saves, so they will be a real slog to get through. If the enemy tries to shoot them from too close as well, you could also activate Blaring Glory for 1 command point, and that will allow you to turn off any shooting phase rerolls for one given unit if it matters. The elites have a crazy amount of midfield board control. 3 units of Sicarian infiltrators, 2 small ones with flechettes and taser, and the big one with power swords and stub carbines. They can all set up forward, so can scrap for those midfield objectives nice and early. To back them up, there's also a huge amount of Cerberus Raiders, a unit of 7 and a unit of 9. With their pre-game move, they could be a big threat turn 1, and just be some excellent screening and fast-moving harassment ability. Jumping up, maybe sniping a character dead, maybe doing nuisance charges or clearing out light infantry, and potentially falling back when they're charged with their 2 command points Tactica Obliqua stratagem. There's also a unit of 9 Taraxi Sterilizers, a hefty anti-infantry punch that can wait in deep strike reserve if it needs to, and can also jump back into the sky for late game objectives and actions. Finally, we'd come to what I'd argue is the real punch of the army, 3 big units of Sicarian Ruststalkers, all armed with the Transionic Blades. One of them can ride in the Scorpius Dune Rider, the other 2 can foot slog towards the enemy, and as we mentioned they can move incredibly fast indeed, advancing and charging with the veteran cohort stratagem, and Metallica allowing them even further movement options and better damage in combat such as +1 to hit. With 3 attacks apiece they throw out a crazy amount of high AP melee and mortal wounds on 6s. Overall the army looks like a complete nightmare to deal with, a ton of multi-wound tough units with decent invuls, incredibly fast moving and can hit very hard when they do land home. With so many small units around, doing objectives is going to be fairly straightforward. Certainly going to be a challenge for any army to take on. Challenge number 2 is a Death Guard list, and this example of a solid competitive Death Guard army was run by Greg Chamberlain at Imps Gaming GT. As Death Guard go, it's a really shooty army list indeed, with a hefty gun line of 3 Plague Burst Crawlers with the Entropy Cannons, and then 2 Chaos Contemptors with a Twin Volkite, and also Cyclone Missiles on top of that. The Contemptors can get great use out of some of the buffing characters, such as the Tallyman giving 1+1 to hit, and also exploding 6s with Tollkeeper. Certainly not bad if you can also get your target within contagion range for a -1 toughness. Between those general purpose Contemptors and the very scary Plague Burst Crawlers, there's a huge amount of general purpose firepower here, and a decent amount of ignores line of sight shooting with those Plague Burst Mortars. For units to take objectives and hold the midfield, there's 3 units of 10 Poxwalkers, and then 3 units of 3 Death Shroud Terminators, which have been amped up a little bit more, one taking Virulent Fever for mortal wounds on 6s, and one taking the boosted Man Reaper, the Reaper of Glorious Entropy. That's the one that both gets strength ×2 and a flat damage of 3, and some mortal wounds too. To lead the host we have a Demon Prince with wings and a Hellforged sword. He's an absolute beast in close combat as he takes the Warp Insect Hive. This one means he gets to reroll all hits and wounds in combat, and he's going to be pretty tough to take out as well, due to a 5+ Feel No Pain from Revoltingly Resilient. There's a Lord of Contagion with a Man Reaper and the Gloaming Bloat. He can allow some rerolls, and the Gloaming Bloat will shut down enemy rerolls within contagion range. Could be particularly nice with the Flash Outbreak stratagem on another unit. And finally we have the near auto-include unit of the Foul Blightspawn. Very dangerous close-range shooting with Viscous Death and his Plague Sprayer. And he also has the Arch Contaminator Warlord trait to allow some reroll wound rolls for those Death Shroud Terminators. Very little is going to stand in their way with him around, and he'll be making them fight first due to those revolting stench vats. Overall, it's a really interesting take on a Death Guard list. Really quite massive firepower with those gunline units, some cheap and effective objective holders for the Poxwalkers, and then a massive melee threat with those Terminators and the characters. As is usually the case with Death Guard, every single unit in the army is going to be a real slog to kill. Moving on, your third challenge of the day is the Sisters of Battle army, second place at Games Workshop's Orlando Open tournament by John Lennon. Bearing a few similarities to the previous Admech list, it's very infantry heavy. Lots of relatively fast moving units all over the place that can trade out really well and pack some truly staggering punches either at range or in melee. The list is led by Morven Val and Celestine. Celestine's a fast moving and very tough melee threat, and Val does a little bit of everything, shooting, melee and powerful buffs. They combine very nicely with the big unit of Sacrosants, who can basically aim to hide out of line of sight in a ground floor ruin, and then prevent any enemy units from shooting these 2 powerful characters. It means that they can be on display turn 1, and the opponent can't do anything to shoot them. Otherwise we have a Bloody Rose Patrol for the melee units and an Ebon Chalice Outrider. They're the sisters who can manipulate miracle dice and allow you to expend an extra 1 to get a 6. The Bloody Rose have a unit of Battle Sisters, 2 units of 8 Repentia, 1 with a Repentia Superior, and I believe that 1 squad would hang out in the Rhino. The Repentia Superior can make one of the units have a massive +1 to wound, and between that, the innate Bloody Rose melee buffs, and tear them down for auto wounds on 6s, there's very little that they won't go through in a single turn. Finally, there's 2 units of Zephyrim, fast moving jump pack sisters with power swords, and they can certainly be propelled to far greater melee threat with Morven Val's rerolls if they're needed. Otherwise, a very solid unit for objectives and actions. Otherwise, for the Ebon Chalice, who can be packing 2 Sacred Rites at once, we have Celestine and the Gemini, a big unit of 9 Sacrosants with the Halberds. They'll be great for protecting the characters, and 1 other character in the Dogmata with the Sigil Ecclesiasticus for an extra war hymn, and the Terrible Knowledge command point farming warlord trait from the Ebon Chalice themselves. She can improve the Shield of Faith of 1 unit by 1 with her Litany of Enduring Faith, and can use the Verse of Holy Piety to add an extra Sacred Rite to 1 unit. I don't believe that that's order locked, so you could do something like give an extra Sacred Rite to the Repentia if you wanted. As a Dogmata, she can also make nearby units obsec as well, which is pretty handy for all these non-troops that are floating around. Otherwise, for the Ebon Chalice, we have 2 Rhinos absolutely loaded out with shooty goodness, each one with a unit of 5 Dominions with 4 Artificer Stormbolters in. They have the stratagem for 6s converting to 2 mortal wounds each, so that's potentially a very cheap 6 mortal wounds that each squad could dump out if you invest a command point in them. They also let the Rhinos move pre-game, allowing them to get into more threatening positions. Along for the ride, we also have a couple of units of 5 Retributors, a really quite interesting loadout with 2 Multi-Melters and 2 Heavy Flamers in. You most often see people spamming 3 or 4 of the same weapon. but I think it's quite an interesting one, as combined with a couple of Armorium Cherubs, it means that they can pretty much be an equal threat to either infantry or heavy tanks, and it just depends on the guns that you juice up with the Cherubs to allow them to fire again. Having a Melter, Bolter and Flamer in the same unit means that you could use the Holy Trinity if you wanted. You could get maximum hits with the Flamers as well for a big 24 hits automatically, and you could potentially use the Ebon Chalice Cleansing Flame stratagem to have a very good chance of inflicting 3 mortal wounds on the target as well. Quite nice to see Retributors that are quite so flexible at either killing infantry or tanks. Finally, for another couple of fairly cheap manoeuvrable units, we have 2 squads of 5 Seraphim, each of which have 4 Hand Flamers in. They can jump around the board doing actions, but if they need to absolutely melt an enemy infantry squad, then they certainly can. With Deadly Descent, you could double fire those Hand Flamers and pistols, and that would average you over 30 strength 4 hits on the enemy. Certainly enough to toast a backfield objective scoring squad, and they could use their Ebon Chalice stratagem again if they wanted. Overall, again, really quite a lot going on with this list. Several enormous melee threats in the characters and the 2 Repentia blobs, 4 very nasty shooting units popping out of those rhinos, and a bunch of jump pack sisters to jump around the board fighting fast moving units and scoring secondaries. When well hidden behind a lot of terrain, I can only imagine that this will be an absolute nightmare to deal with. Your 4th challenge of the 5 are Drukhari, one of the biggest and baddest codexes of 9th edition right now, and this list was created by Matt Root, who took first at Flying Monkey Con with it. It does have the fairly typical triple patrol setup, but a few of the selections are maybe not the typical cookie cutter Drukhari list. Rather than going for Black Heart on the Cabal patrol, we have Obsidian Rose instead. That's the one that grants the extra range and the reroll wound roll rather than hit roll. It's quite a small patrol, just with the fairly standard Archon with Hatred Eternal and the Gym Blade. Between that and fighting twice, it's going to be a massive threat with an extra 3 attacks and rerolling all hits and wounds. There's then a unit of 10 Kabbalat Trueborn, 2 Blasters and a Dark Lance. Certainly will have a very nice threat range in the Obsidian Rose, and will put that wound roll to good use, and they'll be mounted in one of the raiders from the Dark Technomancers. Finally, there's a unit of 5 Incubi, and there's another couple in the Dark Technomancers patrol. As always, just very cheap and effective for what they do with their enormous melee threat. For the Witch patrol, we of course have the Cult of Strife, 2 enormously fighty Succubi, one taking the Razor Flails, Dark Lotus Toxin and Precision Blows, a good chance for a lot of mortal wounds if you roll a few 6s to hit, and that one's also a Master Succubus as well. The other one takes the Triptych Whip and Competitive Edge, and should be near enough guaranteed to punch through a whole load of wounds against the enemy. There's a big squad of Witches to throw out an enormous amount of strength 4 attacks, and Hecatrix takes Morvane's Agonizer to stop the unit from falling back that they just fought. Could be a good way to keep them safe in melee, as Witches really don't like being shot if they can avoid it. And to round out the patrol, we have a unit of 5 Mandrakes for deploying midfield, and 2 units of 3 Reavers with Hypex for excellent mobility for things like secondaries or making nuisance charges on things that really don't want to be charged. Finally, there's really quite interesting use of the Homunculus Dark Technomancer's Coven, the one that got really quite heavily nerfed as it no longer works with liquefier guns. At the time I did wonder why they didn't decide to also nerf it on the Spirit Siphon of the Kronos as well, as again that's basically an auto-hitting weapon that really enjoys having a +1 to wound and also damage too. It makes these 3 units of Kronos have really quite an efficient anti-infantry hoover, and they're also just quite natively tough for their points and pack a bit of punch in melee as well, with the potential to restore some slain models from nearby squads. Those units will be quite annoying to deal with, some really sturdy bricks that are going to be able to hold whatever objective they're sent to, and are going to require more firepower or attention to bring them down than they're really worth. The Raiders are all in here as well, also making use of the Dark Technomancer's advantage. +1 to wound and +1 damage isn't too bad on Dark Lances, even if it comes at the expense of some mortal wounds if you roll a 1. And finally there's a couple of units of Racks, each with an Ossifactor and Hex Rifle, the Dark Technomancer's advantage making them far more efficient upgrades. Finally, to lead the patrol instead of a Homunculus, we have Drazar, giving the list its 4th enormously efficient close combat character. Overall, as is often the case with Drukhari, quite an enormous amount of threats here. 4 raiders full of scary things moving up, some beefy Kronos units moving up while you deal with all the rest, and a few utility units skimming around and scoring all the points. And as ever with Drukhari, they're usually going to be fighting on their own terms, hiding behind terrain, then advancing and charging into your models on turn 2. Definitely going to be a challenge to come out on top of all of that, when most of the units can trade out for something that's far higher than their points cost. Finally, your 5th and last challenge of a list to beat. Here's an example from the new Orks codex, and this time it's all out boggy spam with the list that Manichima used to take first at the WG Open Summer Slaughter. I was wondering if anyone will be experimenting with blood axes now some of the other more go-to clans have been nerfed a bit, and it certainly seems they're out in force with these boggies. The list is organised into 2 blood axe outrider detachments, and the Deathkiller War Trike is the war boss, meaning that the army will be a speed war, so it can get a couple of extra turns with extra AP on all the weapons, and advance and shoot with anything that's an assault weapon, which the rocket truck squig boggies are a good example of. The vast majority of the points of the list are piled into a huge amount of boggies, 3 units of 3 Megatrack scrapjets and 3 units of 3 rocket truck squig boggies. They do seem to be the most efficient in terms of firepower and also pack a bit of melee on top of that. The scrapjets will fire out an average of 8 rocket shots in total, so working together should be able to do pretty well at anti-tank and dealing with 3 wound infantry. They're also pretty solid in melee as well, with mortal wound impact hits, chased down with a bunch more strength 8 attacks. Blood axes really do offer quite a lot for these big boggy lists. They get light cover at longer range, and if the opponent does tag them in melee, it means they can still fall back and shoot if they want to. A little bit more resilient, and very flexible if they do get rushed. The other 3 are a crazy amount of these rocket truck squig boggies, which as well as being a fast unit that is somewhat melee capable, they're perhaps one of the stronger artillery units in the game right now. Each one will average you around about 3 or 4 strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 hits on its target, and that's just with the primary weapon, never mind the smaller squig launcher that it also has. That means that between the 9 of them you've got around 30 or so of those hits landing home, which could easily be enough to wipe out a full squad of Space Marines per turn, even if they happen to be hiding out of line of sight. It's just so handy to be able to point that deletion ray on exactly what you need to most. The list can be incredibly tough at range as well. They already get light cover from being blood axes, but they're further protected by a big mech with a custom force field, and they can use the Speed Freak stratagem for an extra -1 to hit, which could cover a significant amount of the army if he did position the units right. Talking of that big mech as well, he can also use the stratagem to make a 5+ invul save for a turn with his force field, and he also comes decked out with the pretty excellent Warlord trait for redeploying 3 units at the game's start, which he could potentially use to put enormous amounts of the boggies into strategic reserve if necessary, and also a bit of a command point farm with a 4+ to regenerate 1 at the start of each turn. All that while he can sit there fixing up boggies all game long. Finally, for a couple of units for objectives and actions, there are 2 units of 5 Storm Boys and 1 unit of 5 Commandos. The Commandos can start in the midfield, and the Storm Boys can have some truly spectacular movement range when they want to, as they can auto-advance 6 inches. They can also deep strike and go back into strategic reserve with the Blood Axe stratagem as well. So for a minimal investment in bodies, they really are a very efficient investment for getting actions and things done. Overall, just having the sheer amount of similar targets to deal with could put a real strain on your opponent's firepower. Between invuls, -1 to hits, light cover and the excellent ramshackle rule, these really aren't going down that easy, and are going to hit back very, very hard in return. So that just about brings us to the end of our challenges to your army. Let me know how you think you'd fare against the armies down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming, with new videos dropping just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying a lot of my videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.